excited about the discussion this evening.
Amen. Appreciate
I
it.
only have 4 pages of notes.
Wow.
It should be an exciting.
I'm gonna make you the chairperson.
Nope.
Mark, what's up?
Hey,
That's a pass. That's a pass.
I'll make you the chairperson. You're doing that kind of work.
That's
Pastor
a
Stacy,
no for me.
Jim, Carla.
Good evening, sir. How are you guys?
Good evening, everybody.
Good to see all y'all.
Good to see you too.
I feel like Tank on the Matrix tonight. If you are who we think you are, it's an exciting time.
You and these references, you did it Sunday.
You didn't watch the Matrix? You didn't watch the Matrix?
He quotes Star Trek, and my husband gets it. He's quoting Neo from the Matrix in his sermons. Again, my husband
Matrix
gets
about
it.
19 times.
I got nothing.
Sorry. But I have a poster that says, "Everything I know, I learned from Star Trek." Vince, what's up?
I'm on mute. I'm doing good, sir, and you? Now I can't hear. I wonder what's going on. Let's see here. I don't know if I have sound.
We can hear you loud and clear. You sound great.
Okay. All right.
So I got another computer. How is my sound coming across, Katie?
We can hear you loud and clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Bishop, for your information, I have allowed everyone into the room who's in the waiting room, and we are live on YouTube.
We'll get ready to get started. All right, we're about ready to start here. We think we got most everybody on that's coming on, and Katie will let anybody else that's coming here. I mean, can you feel the excitement? I mean, I'm looking at y'all faces. I mean, can you feel it? It's palpable. So glad you're on. I think we're doing important work, and I'm excited and blessed to be a part of this group and what it is that we're doing. So Katie's going to put up a slide, and we're going to work our way in and start hearing those reports. I've been looking at what you've been doing, and I think it's a great start. We just want to get some reports tonight and get a little bit of fill in with what's going on. This is Racial Equity Social Justice Task Force Executive Committee meeting April 13, 2021. I'm so excited. I don't have a lot of housekeeping tonight. We just want to kind of move in the reports are really what's most important tonight. So we hope that you are ready, raring to go to just share about 8 minutes of what it is that you are doing and where you're heading, so that we will be able to kind of make an evaluation, see where we're headed, make suggestions, get feedback, all of that kind of stuff. So I don't want to take away from the excitement. Communications, you can go ahead and take your 8 minutes. There is some other stuff that Katie had there, but I'm gonna just, Katie, go back a minute. I'll try to hit some of this stuff. So we're trying to create a pro-equity agenda for the city of Akron, outlining the 5-year strategic plan. We're striving to uncover structural and institutional racism in our community. So chairpersons were asked to utilize the following format in their Q1 report: give an introduction, history, or the subcommittee topic in the city of Akron, areas of concern, methodology, policy options, and then a conclusion. And from what I could see, most of you have really followed that well. So here, how we're going to proceed down. So we're going to go ahead and jump to communications by Chair Carla Davis. Carla, come on in there, girl.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. I am I'm sorry, I apologize. I had my slide up and ready. And let me pull up my Word document. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Bishop Johnson.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Again, the Communications Subcommittee is comprised of 9 members. The subcommittee chair and co-chair are Carla Davis and Brandon Scarborough, respectively. Our regular meetings are held at 6:30 p.m. on the first Thursday of each month. The Communications Subcommittee has convened 4 meetings during the first quarter of 2021. The inaugural January 5th meeting was an introductory session. The February 1 meeting centered on clarification of the subcommittee's purpose and a discussion of the question, what makes racial equity important to you? Team members shared their motivations for participating in this important work. The second half of the February 1st meeting involved a subcommittee review of our racial equity statement, which was revised to include two-way communication. And that's very, very important. That's a very important phrase, two-way communication. A second subcommittee meeting on February 10th was convened solely to discuss the City of Akron's communications efforts with Annie McFadden, Chief of Staff and Deputy Mayor for Administration. Our subcommittee is researching the historical information about communication practices, methods, and channels in the City of Akron. And Ms. McFadden's presentation of external communications efforts covered the city's communications history and current practices. And we learned past main communication mediums have been traditional in nature: weekly press conferences, press releases, and direct one-on-ones with trusted media sources. Social media was not leveraged or highly used at the time. Weekly newsletters were done for a period and were largely printed, as were larger printed city magazines and calendars, and these items were mailed to Akron residents. The communication team was comprised of 2 people. And then, of course, transitions occurred. And those transitions impacted the city's traditional modes of communication. Those transitions included major shifts in city budget beginning in 2008 and into 2011, and we all recall the recession, and there were reductions to the LGF. Advent of social media shifted the landscape. Trust in media and government institutions began to decline, and there were expectations of conversation, just not one-way communication, not just one-way communication. Present communications includes social media, press releases, press conferences, the annual city magazine that has been both printed and mailed and digital. And there is currently a communications team of 4 people. We learned that the city is proactively taking steps to embed communications experts in key departments as well. So they rely more on a stronger social media presence, both digital media and resources. The results of the presentation, there is an increased understanding of the progression that the Office of the Mayor has made in the past decade. As I mentioned, the past practice was a strong print media and only one staff person handling professional communications on behalf of the mayor. Present practices include a more interactive media focus, social media, teletown halls, and 4 professionals responsible for aspects of communication on behalf of the mayor. Our communications subcommittee identified 3 areas of concern. We are concerned with the city's ability and capacity to create opportunities and avenues for two-way communication. We are aware of a communication problem. We need to be able to identify where that communication breakdown is happening. Number 2, we are concerned with the city's current capacity to establish creative channels that reach the public effectively. Categorically, criminal justice, healthcare, and communications would benefit from initial focus as an opportunity to improve the public awareness and acumen. And number 3, we are concerned with the COVID pandemic and how it will hamper our subcommittee's ability to connect with diverse groups of Akron residents in order to identify specific communication needs. We are missing opportunities to attend in-person meetings at recreation centers and community gatherings due to some restrictions related to the pandemic. Our methodology and initial research efforts. Our subcommittee is researching, as I said, communication practices, methods, and channels in the city. And we've sought answers from Annie McFadden, who also consulted with former Plusquellic Administration Communications Director, Stephanie York. She's also my Leadership Akron Class 29 classmate. I have to throw that in there. We wanted to dig deeper, so we formed another work group composed of Jose Delgado and Linda Ray to assess and further delve into data gathering and metrics. So on February 18th, Jose and Linda engaged with Annie McFadden to hone in on the data information that would glean the most value with regard to how practices could evolve. Linda and Jose framed their research in the spirit of contributing to those already built-in channels. The goal was to gather some granularity on the efforts of communication. For example, the Akron Recreation Department, we don't know a lot about that, for 2 purposes. 1, to better enable community committee members such as ourselves to educate the public, and 2, to create an awareness of existing opportunities for improvement. The questions in that research effort were asked: what has worked well or has been most impactful, and how do you measure impact? Which tool or initiative has not had the intended impact? Of the task force subcommittee categories, which do you feel the public is most informed about or least informed about? And how can our subcommittee be utilized as a catalyst on a project you are currently working on to progress it to the next phase? Lastly, are policy options and responsive actions currently being considered by our communication subcommittee? Increasing communication with English language learners, addressing the misconception that people for whom English is not their first language lack intelligence. Coordinating a survey on behalf of the task force to solicit ideas for the city to improve communication with non-white residents. And 3rd, engaging other subcommittees on potential questions to include in a citywide survey. So in conclusion, in addition to the continued pursuit of identifying potential two-way modalities of communication channels for Akron residents, the communication subcommittee would like to engage its peer subcommittees on the task force to gain a better understanding of their work with the end goal of communicating that to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. I think that your subcommittee is very important, because I think that in the various reports that I've seen, other municipalities, other cities, communication is either omitted or assumed. It is assumed that that's taking place. We don't want to assume that, so we appreciate your work. Thank you. All right, we're going to move to the next group. I think that's criminal justice.
The next group listed on the agenda is the Criminal Justice Subcommittee, presentation by Chair Bill Rich.
Okay, great.
Good evening. I've been, along with Kemp Boyd, co-chairing the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. The criminal justice system includes policing, prosecution and defense, adjudication, and corrections. But to date, the Criminal Justice Subcommittee has focused almost exclusively on policing, because in the subcommittee's view, that's the component of the criminal justice system that most urgently requires reform in order to redress racial inequity and social injustice. The subcommittee may later expand its focus to include other aspects of the criminal justice system. That remains to be seen. So far, the subcommittee has focused on 5 subjects concerning policing, for each of which a working group has been formed. The first one is police accountability mechanisms, police auditor, inspector general, citizen review board. The second is body-worn camera legislation and policy. The third is police hiring and promotion practices. The fourth is police training. And the fifth is community policing. So each of those working groups has been meeting, as has the subcommittee as a whole. The subcommittee as a whole has been meeting twice a month. So first, the police accountability mechanisms. Although the subcommittee has been considering whether the city of Akron should have a citizen, or sometimes called civilian, review board, it quickly concluded that the most immediate need was for the existing police auditor to have the resources and access to the information necessary for him to perform his assigned functions, and that to date, he has not had those resources or access to that information, or at least adequate access to that information. And so after hearing from the police auditor and some members of city council, the subcommittee arrived at a set of recommendations that were interim recommendations to address this immediate need. And they dealt with 2 subjects: the resources and access to information. The recommendations concerning resources were 3. The first was that the police auditor position should be made full-time. It was full-time years ago when it was initiated, but then reduced to part-time. Second, that there should be a full-time deputy police auditor. And third, there should be a full-time administrative assistant assigned to the police auditor. The first and third of those recommendations, full-time police auditor and full-time administrative assistant, were immediately embraced by the mayor and by the city council. The second one, and so those are going forward. The second one, the full-time deputy police auditor, has not yet been embraced. One of the committee's concerns is succession planning. The current police auditor will probably not remain in that office for a lot longer, and having a deputy police auditor would be one way of potentially providing for succession. Concerning access to information, the committee made a set of specific recommendations that I won't go into detail on in here. They're available in the report that I submitted. There's been some back and forth between representatives of the administration and the subcommittee about the timing of the police auditor's access to information. That, on reflection, I think comes down to different conceptions of the role of the police auditor. I would say that there are really two different roles. One is the auditing role, and the other is could be called an ombudsman role. And I think historically, the police auditor, although he was called a police auditor, has filled both of those roles. And the subject that's being discussed right now is whether the police auditor should be purely an auditor and therefore perhaps not have as immediate access to information as he might, or whether he should also be performing the role of ombudsman so that he can be a liaison between the police on the one hand and the community on the other, and help in some ways help to potentially diffuse tensions that could arise from misunderstandings about the facts and about what's going on. So that's currently where that discussion lies. As far as the Citizen Review Board or Civilian Review Board is concerned, we've heard from a city official in Columbus who has played an integral role in their implementation to the extent that it's been implemented so far, their implementation of the Civilian Review Board and Inspector General model. And we are still in the process of arriving at a position and formulating recommendations along those lines. As far as the body-worn camera legislation and policy group is concerned, the initial focus has been on police auditors' access to body-worn camera video footage. That subject is still under discussion, and it's tied up in what I just described by way of different conceptions about what the role of the police auditor should be. But that group will also be working on the subject of public access. It has to some extent already, but we'll be working more on the subject of public access to body-worn camera footage and probably in cases involving use of force. That hasn't really been defined yet, but it'll have to be narrowed because there is so much body-worn camera footage that it wouldn't be feasible for much of it to be made public, because it all has to be reviewed for redaction. As far as police hiring and promotion practices are concerned, what the subcommittee has learned so far is that the greatest number of candidates, including especially minority candidates, are eliminated by the first two steps in the process. There's the written test and the physical fitness exam, followed by the background check, which does not eliminate nearly as many candidates as the first two tests do. Been some focus on psychological exam and some concern about that and the lack of diversity in the personnel who administer the psychological exams. But as a practical matter, that doesn't seem to eliminate very many people. Police training, we haven't made quite as much progress with, but it's expected that the subcommittee's recommendations will focus in part on implicit bias and de-escalation training, both of which seem to be very much needed. And then finally, community policing. The subcommittee will be looking at, and its working group will be looking at national standards and best practices in other jurisdictions, and formulating recommendations for what we hope will be a much fuller implementation of community policing strategies, so that it is a strategy that pervades the police force and not limited to relatively few police officers who are assigned to do community policing. And that concludes my report.
Thanks, Brother Bill. We appreciate it. And I think it's especially significant that you've already had a couple of recommendations accepted and implemented by the mayor. I just think that's significant. So keep up the good work. We appreciate the report.
Thank you.
All right, we got the Education Subcommittee report by Co-Chair Jolene Lane.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Bishop Johnson.
You're welcome.
On behalf of Mr. Bruce Alexander, who is my chair, who serves as a leader on the Akron School Committee. Akron School Board is currently engaged in hiring us a new superintendent, so he's not able to be here this evening and sends his regards. I'm happy to give the report for the Education Subcommittee. As we have discovered and know from that racial equity and social justice have for generations had a very complicated relationship with education. And we did a great amount of research into both the history of education as well as the history of education in Akron. We are looking at several different issues. We have a 19-person subcommittee, and the Racial Equity and Social Justice Taskforce Education Subcommittee has taken on the task to research information in the following areas impacting education, and we will make recommendations for policy implications. These areas include student access, student-centered learning and closing the achievement gap, pandemic recovery as it relates to student achievement, cultural responsiveness, looking specifically at intercultural competence and culturally responsive pedagogy, and fiscal transparency, all of these things as they relate to education. So when we think about the historical context of education in the city of Akron, the Akron Public School District actually is a minority school district. The APS educates more than 21,000 students and has one of the largest and most diverse student populations in the state of Ohio, employs 3,000 teaching and non-teaching professionals, and the district covers all of Akron. It educates students who are Black, White, Asian, and Pacific Islander, Latino or Latinx, American, Indian, and Native American, and students with multiple races. And numerically speaking, the district is primarily composed of Black students and white students. In the 2019-2020 school year, 46% of the Akron public school students identified as Black, while 31% identified as white. By comparison, this is not in sync with the demographics of the city as a whole. And so the APS student demographics, because they do not reflect the racial demographics of the city, we'll be looking at this in further detail and exploring this further in our Q2 report. The historical context then is such that our analysis is looking at the history of Akron Public Schools as compiled for these purposes, and our subcommittee is still working to assemble a strong historical reference point regarding the past century of Akron Public Schools history. So we're also looking at funding history and funding structures. There have been a number of forward-moving and forward-thinking ideals around funding structures and the ways in which our public schools are funded. And the present day district features 9 high schools, 9 middle schools, 27 elementary schools, 2 dedicated preschool buildings, 2 specialty schools, including STEM schools, preschools in several of the elementary schools. We have pre-engineering, college and career academy programs, and dual degree programs as well. We are primarily focusing on K through 12 public education, although we will have some of our input will be around the areas of higher education as well. So the areas of concern, as I mentioned, that we are addressing, will research these main aspects, and we'll be making recommendations that are within the scope and authority of the mayor's office, for the mayor's office to take leadership in these areas. For student access, there are programs in place to improve student learning and achievement, and the ability of these programs and access by all is an ethical concern which we wish to work on. Student-centered learning and closing the achievement gap. The educational institutions at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary levels must all engage to enable students to achieve and aspire to the highest levels of education. For the pandemic recovery and as it relates to student achievement, the research has shown that many students have fallen further behind because of the quarantine. And now that schools are back in session for a majority of our students, but not all, I think that we will have to look at how the quarantine and the remote learning has impacted the progress and the achievement of our students. Cultural responsiveness. We are looking at the hiring of diverse staff, as well as classroom teachers, counselors, paraprofessionals, and student leaders. We also want to, school leaders. We also want to make sure that the diversity of values and core values are represented in the schools, and that we have culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogy for our students, which will make the schools both welcoming and be an effective tool to determine the metrics and assessments so that the concerns that are related to cultural responsiveness are met. Fiscal transparency. The operations must ensure equitable resource and financial allocations. This includes spending, program decisions, district boundaries, and other decisions. Business procurement and supplier diversity are also goals that we will be addressing. So in terms of our policy options, we have currently outlined 5 strategies. The first strategy is to make a public declaration expressing the need for equity in education. Our second strategy is to forge strategic partnerships with the following sectors: philanthropy, nonprofit organizations, government, the business community, and collaborations within different levels of education. Our third strategy is to invest in the necessary leadership to lead equity-based work. And this will play itself out and exemplify in terms of policies, procedures, and practices, engaging and understanding academic institutions, the community engagement, and social justice advocacy. Our fourth strategy is data analysis, measuring and promoting what works programmatically, and in response to that analysis, then moving to make recommendations as well. And then our final strategy is to create sustainability within the programmatic recommendations, using the data to tell a complete story, and implementation of the school system's equity policy, and efforts to help the district better initiate and align efforts to educate students of color and students who are experiencing poverty. So as we find ourselves in this situation of looking at the current state of racial equity and social justice in our nation, we have come a very long way, I think, since the separate but equal doctrines of 2 centuries ago. And we are looking to make sure that our policies are not separating students, not by race, but more by resources and economic inequality has been sort of the unfortunate overlap now in terms of racial justice and social equity. And so that is my report. We will be working to continue to close the achievement gap and make sure that we have equity for our students.
Thank you, Sister Jolene. My response is wow. There's a whole lot in there. I look forward to seeing how you're going to drill down into that. Thank you for your report.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to the Public Health Subcommittee report by Ariel Hopkins.
All right, so thank you, Bishop. And
You're welcome.
I want to start off by just giving a little bit of contents around our group. We have 27 members total, so a very, very big group. We've had 3 meetings so far. Tomorrow will be our 4th meeting. We have meetings every 3rd Wednesday from 12 to 1:30. We've really utilized SurveyMonkey because of the size of the group. So streamlining feedback for the questions that we ask has been tremendous in terms of really narrowing down a focus for this group. Our approach to the group and narrowing down our topics is that, again, we utilize SurveyMonkey to see what was on the and you can go back. This is just extra before I get started. What was on the hearts and minds and concerns of our committee. We asked them to put this information down in the survey. From there, we looked at some data, we brought some experts in, and then we drafted our recommendations and some possible implementation strategies. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about our committee and how it functions. So as far as our definition, I won't read it completely, but I wanted to point out a few words that I thought was very important. And so the word intentional, being very intentional about the work that we are doing and how we are really moving that equity needle. We talked about root causes, so not a surface solution, really getting down to what is the underlying barriers and systemic issues, and how do we remove those barriers? The structures, we talked about structures. We know that a lot of barriers come from systemic things outside of just clinical health. And so we want to address all of those social determinants of health, if you will. And then we want to make sure it's sustainable. We have equitable access, and then we are doing or implementing this comprehensive healthcare service lens. And so we also want to make sure we have inclusive partnerships and that we have representation. So I guess I might as well read the whole definition, but I wanted to point out those key words that we all came up with as a subcommittee. So on the next slide, we are listing some of the data sources that we use to come up with some of the focus areas. We had a lot of help and input with Mariah and Tamika and Bishop. You send a lot of documents that were very, very helpful. One of the documents was the lexicon plan, which brought everything together for us, I feel. And so that is when we really start picking up steam. We have some interviews here that we invited to our meetings to ask some very specific questions once we narrowed down what our focus areas will be. And then we have listed some future guests that we would like to invite to our meeting. So those names and positions are listed there on that slide. On the next slide, we have come up with a total of 4 recommendations. And I just want to say I've had awesome help with my co-chair, Jerome Moss and Mariah, and certain key individuals that have just really stepped in to really pull this together. So just kudos to the whole team. We really came together to make these recommendations solid and action oriented. So the first recommendation deals around mental health. And so our team felt very strongly, given the pandemic, within the pandemic, So a lot of the social justice issues, we want to make sure that we are addressing the increased mental health needs. We also looked at violence. We understood that the city did a lot of work around this issue. It still is a big issue, especially among our Black males. And so how do we advance the work that has already been done? And then the third recommendation talks about activating community and engagement and awareness resources. We all, one of the topics that always stuck with me was the resource rich but communication poor. And so just how do we do a better job of letting the not only employees of the city of Akron, but their families and also the residents of the specific health services and opportunities that are available. And then lastly, we felt very, very strongly about this fourth recommendation, which is making sure whatever we come up with is measured. Again, the phrase, what isn't measured doesn't get done. And so we want to make sure that we have specific key performance indicators as it relates to many of the recommendations that we want to implement. So in the next couple slides, I'll go very quickly through some of the recommendations, and we don't have everything on the slide, but Jerome and I wanted to just pick out a few key things to touch on as it relates to each recommendation. So as we mentioned before, we felt very strongly about making sure we are intentional about this pipeline of diverse provider panels. We want our people to go to the doctor. However, there's a lack of doctors that look like us or accessible to us. And so we want to start examining and holding some of our contracted employees and vendors and our contracted vendors accountable for making sure they have a diverse strategic plan in place to meet the needs of the city and be reflective of the resident and the population that the EAP, which is Employee Assistance Program, is servicing. And so this is a big focus, not only for the city of Akron, we're also looking at this in SUMA, and just encourage all organizations to look at who you are contracting with. And again, have a discussion about the diverse panel and making sure we have enough resources so that if someone says, hey, I would like to talk to someone about what's going on, that is available. We want to make sure we are advancing this grief recovery model. We know that a lot of a stigma is built around the behavioral health in some populations utilizing behavioral health. So the grief recovery model is an excellent kind of in between and provides the community the skill sets to address some of the trauma and the grief that we are all experiencing. So how do we advance and support that effort on a larger scale? And so we really want to utilize our partners here and really invest and facilitate that initiative and how we can better service our community with diverse provider panels, as well as equipping our own community members to address the needs within their own families and the community members that they serve. On the next slide is recommendation 2. As we stated, there is a wonderful youth violence prevention plan that a lot of us worked very, very hard and committed resources to. And so we are wanting to advance that work and have someone very dedicated to that position. They wake up and that is their focus, advancing that plan, coalescing the partners, and making sure we are moving that plan that we worked so hard and we invested so much in. And so we know that the position that Tamika has done an amazing job with, that was kind of the idea in terms of taking this collective responsibility to address issue in our community. And so we really wanted to explore possibly drafting a position to, again, be 100% focused on advancing this initiative. Our recommendation 3 talks about activating a community and engagement health awareness resource. So again, a lot of us in the health field understand and know the value of our community health workers, being that liaison and ambassador when it comes to really connecting and building trust between a lot of systemic programs and organizations and initiatives. And so while we have Tamika on the larger scale with the hospitals and advocating for policy and change and doing an awesome job, we also felt that we also feel that we could benefit from a community health worker type of role that can communicate some of the initiatives, some of the policies, and some of the changes, some of the advisory councils that we are mentioning to create. And so that is one of the recommendations that we have to activate that engagement and health awareness resource in the form of a community health worker. And then our next recommendation is to activate the diversity scorecard and assessment strategy. Again, there is not a comprehensive equity scorecard available that measures the DEI efforts and the anti-racist efforts that are going on within the city. Again, there's a lot of great work that's being done, but we want to be able to tell our story and see the needle move with some of these policies and procedures that we're putting in place. And so this, again, kind of goes across the board. But again, it's that putting that structure in place that will warrant transparency and accountability with all of our policy and decision makers when it comes to budgets, all of that good work that's being done. And then lastly, we are currently reviewing the lead service line replacement project as it relates to one of the projects that is going to be happening within the city of Akron, and really digging deep in terms of the pipes, what area codes, what zip codes will it affect, making sure our communities of color have clean water. And so we will have Chris Ludo, Director of Public Service, to discuss this policy and if this is something that will align with one of our possible recommendations. And then the last slide is we are excited. We had to do a little bit of navigating given the structure with the health department and the city of Akron, but it's been a very informative process. And we've had a lot of great feedback, and we look forward to just all of your feedback on how we can further define our work and our focus areas. So thank you.
Terry, thank you so much for your report. And I'm deeply impacted by your report because one of my concerns is always emotional, psychological, spiritual health. Been working in that field for a long time trying to help people. So it's just good to see what your group is doing. And I'm excited about it. I'm ready to go out right now. Okay, let me calm down. Sister Katie, what's next? Okay, Housing Subcommittee, Chair Brian Gage. Brian, you on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to chat and present what we've been working on here in the Housing Subcommittee. I want to talk a little bit first about how we started the process. So started the process with the committee by trying to figure out what we really wanted to put together. And that was a strategic plan. So we used a traditional strategic plan methodology and took some staff from the Housing Authority and some other folk and began doing a data collection. We did an environmental scan and saw what was already available, what data was out there. We noticed that the city did a market value analysis that basically tells us what market values for various neighborhoods are throughout the city. We looked at the city's analysis of impediments to fair housing, which was last done, I believe, in 2013, may have been 2012. We looked at various neighborhood plans that had been done over the last 5 to 10 years, nonprofit plans, government strategic plans, and other housing plans, and studies that currently existed, and kind of brought all that data together. We used census data also and put some maps together and some tables and did some analytics based on census tract, based on zip code, as well as based on neighborhoods, traditional neighborhoods that are found in Akron, to identify where poverty concentrations are, where minority concentrations are, and where there's home ownership challenges or high rental rates. All of that information was presented really to the committee right around the first meeting for them to look at and evaluate, find any gaps, contribute to the research. So over the last few months, we've looked at that data. Different members have contributed additional research. So we have a substantial kind of library of material that we've put together to kind of start the process. The call to committee members was to take a look at that data out there. And then we put out a survey to analyze what the city's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats were in making progress towards housing equality in Akron. So members were asked to distribute that survey widely, not only themselves, but anyone that they knew that they could get to take the survey. So we distributed that and we pulled together all the data. So I kind of call that phase one, which was the data collection. Phase two kind of began with organization of all that data that we collected. So we kind of sorted it and organized it and put it into themes and issue areas. And then we also kind of brainstormed on possible policy options that are kind of reflected in the report. At that point, once we did all that brainstorming, we established focus groups with 2 to 4 committee members in each focus group to kind of look at each issue area and each action item and do a fleshing out or a more detail. And just so you know, that's kind of where we are now. The meeting that we had this month, which was right after this report was due, all of the focus groups gave, kind of their analysis of action items. So kind of going forward is going to be looking at that analysis, kind of reshuffling the deck, seeing where things kind of merge together and seeing where things diverge, and then going forward with revising our action items and our objectives. But so that was really the methodology, and I wanted to start with that just to give you a little bit of background. But essentially what we found out from our data analysis and from the information collecting is that Akron is not exempt from the discriminatory practices that happened through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and still we see their effects today. There are Black areas of town, there are white areas of town, there are poor areas of town, and there are wealthier areas of town. And people are segregated here in Akron. We have looked at the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act requires us to do something, take affirmative actions to desegregate. So what we know about Akron's housing stock is that it's fairly old. It's well constructed. The houses have been around for 60 to 80 years in a lot of places, so they're not falling apart. A lot of them are brick made, and they're in good condition, although they might have some environmental issues. Lead, asbestos, those sort of things are the things that these Midwestern cities like Akron have to deal with an older housing stock. There hasn't been much new construction through most of the 21st century. Most of the housing that's here is old. If new things have been done, it's been kind of through rehabilitation of existing homes. And the Akron market isn't really conducive to new construction, right? When you have a median housing value of right now, it's about $90,000 in Akron, but you have a $200,000 construction cost for a new home, it really doesn't make sense to build something new. So we do have these struggles in the housing market of what to do to get kind of the housing stock upgraded and modernized in a market that really does not support new development and new construction. So fortunately, we've been making a little bit of progress. At the 5 years ago, the median housing price in Akron was $57,000, and now it's up to $97,000. So housing prices have been increasing, which is good because that creates more equity, more ability for people to lend, more ability for banks to lend, and kind of the more equity in the houses, the more cash gets to flow and the more investment. So we think there's really some bright sides with the increase in housing prices that are coming in Akron. Although there are some downsides too. I'm not going to mitigate the disadvantage to that. So we kind of identified 3 areas of concern that we were focusing on. One area of concern was disinvestment in certain communities. And normally those communities are ones that have high rates of Black population and low income population. And that's not just disinvestment by the city, but that's disinvestment by banks, that's disinvestment by landlords, that's and other property owners, even homeowners not really investing in keeping their houses up. So what's very interesting is those areas of disinvestment or low market value areas also align with historical redlining maps. So that history of redlining and lack of investing in those communities continues still today, decades, even half a century later. So that was one of our areas of concern. The second area of concern was what we called integration. And that was providing opportunities for people of color to move into neighborhoods that they historically have been excluded from. So this is really kind of falls into the category of moving renters, low-income families, and minorities into areas that historically were not rental areas, were mostly home ownership areas, and giving people opportunity to access the schools, the amenities, and the job opportunities in those communities that have those more accessible and available to it. So integration was our second area of focus, and the third was the wealth gap. And the wealth gap is essentially broken down into people of color, Black families have a less rate of home ownership than white families. And that also correlates with the old redlining maps and the locational maps. Home ownership is lower in Black communities, which are also poorer communities, which are also areas that were historically redlined. So we see this history and this history carrying forward, which is what motivates us to kind of figure out, after half a century of dealing with it, what we can do to make a difference. So we took those 3 strategies, investing in neighborhoods of disinvestment, providing opportunities of people of color to move into more integrated communities, and decreasing the wealth gap. And that's when we broke up into these subcommittees. So we have roughly a dozen or so subcommittees. They just submitted their kind of individual reports last week. So I'm looking forward to going through those reports. But I can go through really quickly some of the possible action items and highlight some of the other ones that I think are really important. And one of the action items is to prioritize housing improvements in communities with higher concentrations of poverty. And again, that's both incentivizing landlords to improve their units as well as governmental investment, and trying to figure out how we can get banks to lend in some of those areas by providing some sort of equity. And also in there is blight removal and targeting blight removal in those areas with low market values to see if that can increase the market values. Strategy 2 of providing opportunities for people of color to live in more integrated communities. One of the things specifically that I want to mention here is that one of our proposals, which I will not take credit for this committee coming up with the idea, was to propose source of income legislation. And that's been around for a while. And it's been around, and the idea has been tossed around in the city of Akron for about a year. But I do want to let the distinguished members of the committee know that the current, there has been legislation introduced at the city level for source of income legislation. What that does is that provides that a landlord cannot discriminate on a tenant based on their source of income, including acceptance of a voucher or acceptance of any type of public assistance, as well as any other types of source of income, whether it be donations from churches, from the United Way, from other folks. We allow, the legislation would allow landlords to pick their tenant, but not to pick how the tenant pays their rent. So we think this is strong progress. We hope that before our report is done, that the city passes some source of income legislation. And I'd also encourage members of this committee to talk to their local city council members and folks about support for source of income legislation. We believe this is a big step in promoting fair housing in the community. The last group was the decreasing the wealth gap and improving home ownership. And we've been looking at possible ways, and I think this is going to be the most challenging one, is how do we incentivize folks to buy houses in those areas where home ownership is low. And I think this one is one we're going to have to think of some new and innovative approaches from, and get some unique lending strategies, possibly from the city or from some banks out there. So I'm really looking forward to kind of digging into all my subcommittee's reports, going through that, and we're shuffling this for our next quarterly report. Thank you for the time. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Well, Brian, thank you. Outstanding. You covered a whole lot in your presentation, and I'm learning something from each presentation. I learned quite a bit from listening to you about what's going on in our city. So thank you for your work, and I look forward to seeing what's going to come out of it. Sister Katie. Did we get everybody?
I believe so, unless I've overlooked someone.
So Bishop, you didn't do workforce development.
Yeah, we didn't do
I
workforce.
had overlooked someone. I apologize.
Yeah, I thought we got one more. It's Tori. Sister Tori, we don't want to overlook you. We're sorry.
My apologies.
Give us your report, darling.
It's quite okay. It's quite okay. Good evening, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the Workforce and Job Creation Subcommittee and our report. We have had some changes and some ups and downs to our subcommittee. Due to relocation, we lost our original chair, and then due to some increased job responsibilities, we just lost our current chair. So we are kind of retooling and trying to make sure that everybody stays, the committee at least, stays up to date on what our goals are and what our strategy is, and try to keep that cohesiveness going with whoever Bishop puts in place to in turn help me out with the Workforce Development Subcommittee. So as an introduction to the Workforce Development and Equitable Job Creation Subcommittee, our hope is that we were going to create an atmosphere where all current and future residents of the city of Akron, regardless of race, we thought they should have equitable employment outcomes. And so where we went with that is, at the time, our chair, Janae Bragg, and I, we looked inside and really took a couple of meetings to talk to our committee and find out where they felt the city was with this, kind of what's the word on the street, so to speak, with what they're hearing in the community about workforce development. And so we meet at 6 p.m. on the third Wednesday of each month. And we took the first couple of meetings to really talk about what we felt we wanted the direction of this committee to be. We have about 21 team members on the committee, and now we're just kind of going to start talking about breaking that 21 people up into subcommittees to work on some of the areas of concern that we found so far. Just giving a little bit about the workforce history, our subcommittee really wanted to look at the inclusion of minorities in the practice of job creation. So our area of focus was Akron, Ohio, and then more specifically, the city of Akron as an employer. We used the Elevate Greater Akron report as a base for historical perspectives. And then we also dug really deep into that report to look at some specific findings that they had already spent a lot of time looking at within the community. What we found were some key takeaways from that reporting was that much of Akron, particularly the Black population, seems to be excluded from economic opportunity. Middle-class jobs are increasingly rare, and how Akron lacks the workforce skills to fulfill the demand for digitized and mid-tech occupations. It was found that in the realm of IT, that because we're not able to pay a prevailing wage in that area where there are prevailing wages across other states and cities, we tend to lose that talent out of this area, or after they complete their schooling, they're using the city to be a stepboard to larger areas for IT tech type jobs. In addition to those findings, our subcommittee was presented with information with lack of minority presence in managerial positions within the city. Looking at that Elevate Greater Akron report, we recently reviewed information concerning the city's efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion, including the recruiting and hiring practices for Akron Police Department and Akron Fire Department. And so here's where our area of concerns lie. We were concerned about the lack of minority access to jobs that pay prevailing wages and upward mobility opportunities within the city. Additionally, there appears to be a lack of strategic outreach and programs and tactics to attract, retain, and develop employees within the city. While regulatory practices and processes are in place for the city and initial training has been initiated in these areas, there's still some wide gaps that exist. We also looked a little bit at procurement and found that although the city has a focus of being mindful of minorities being included on procurement in the procurement process, we have found that they do not have a mechanism to track spend of minorities or influence the increased inclusion of them on larger city projects. So to date, what our methodology was and how we went about seeking answers is that we again looked at Greater Akron Chamber. We looked at a Connexus Northeast Ohio report, and then we contacted the city about bringing some of their employees forward to us to be interviewed. We interviewed James Hardy, who is from the Department of Integrated Development. We talked to Shelley Goodrich and Sean Volman, who are with the Department of Procurement to look at those procurement practices. And we also talked to Donald Rice, who is the retiring Director of Human Resources, to look at that prevailing wage and that issue with keeping IT talent in the area. So in addition to looking at the local data, interviewing some of the key employees for the city, we just took a thing out of Bishop's book and said, why reinvent the wheel? And we found where there were some white papers and some publications from other cities and states where they are making some headway in the areas that we have found of concern. Specifically, some of the areas that we looked at is that King County in Washington has just published a 4-year equity and social justice strategic plan. We plan to look at that and break it down to equate it to the things that we're looking for with concern about the hiring practices and hiring on contractors on the procurement side. We looked at some initial research found with the city of Cleveland with their Department of Economic Development. And we want to look at that reporting because they have a huge report on helping small businesses grow. And they've done a whole analysis on retaining employees. Same with us in Seattle. There's been a municipal financing of workforce development report created. And then there's also the mayor in the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, launched a workforce development and job training program that we now have a copy of and are going to be analyzing that for breakdown in subcommittee. So where we are now, again, we are creating breakout groups for our 21 team members. We're going to review these practices of the other reports that have been done in the cities that I mentioned. And then we want to look at workforce development programs to build a pipeline of diverse talent who are prepared to keep and retain good paying jobs within the city. We want to look at outreach, advertising, and interviewing and the selection process to make sure that the city has done all they can to put some policies and procedures in place to remove bias from those interviewing and selecting processes for the city. We want to create and give the city some research and recommendations on professional development and retention processes for minorities. We have spoken about doing some job sharing processes as well. In addition, opportunities for the city of Akron to support small minority business growth by looking at some of the larger contracts for the city and making sure that they have a percentage included in the contract to include minority businesses on those contracts. And then also the city's role in existing workforce development partnerships. We've heard about a few programs that have evolved over the years, but they may have only been targeted in the HR area and didn't hit another part of the city's department. So we are open to some additional suggestions that any of the other, I heard some synergies but with the the education committee also talked about a little bit with procurement. So there may be some synergies there. But again, Bishop, right now we are taking all of this information and have completed our interviews and are now going to move into subcommittees to really digest this information and figure out what type of processes we can put in place as recommendations for the city.
Mr. Torrey, thank you. I'm glad we didn't miss that because that's important. And I want to thank you for being one of the stable points while the folks around you are switching and moving. Thank you for hanging in there and continuing to work. And we do have a new chair for you, and we've talked about it a little bit. I won't announce that tonight, but we will announce it and we'll move forward. I am excited that y'all would let me be the leader of all that is going on right now. Those are some outstanding reports. There's a lot of work there. There's a lot of stuff going on. Next deadline coming up will be July the 1st. As we look at those particular, I won't go over that. You should receive, if you have not already received, you should have received or will receive some kind of scorecard so that those of us who are part of the executive committee can begin to make recommendations and make feedback. So the purpose of Q1 was to facilitate two-way communication between the Taskforce executive committee and the subcommittee. And so now we're going to be looking at and doing some evaluation so that we can kind of provide the feedback that we hope will help you to move forward into where you are. So it's exciting. That's where we are. You can see what we're going to look at for the executive committee. Here's some questions to consider. We'll make sure you get these. Do the subcommittees appear to have made appropriate progress towards the ultimate goal? The subcommittees appear to have sufficient data to support their claims or concern. Can you think of a resource which would support any of the subcommittee's efforts to better inform their recommendations of the report? Resources could include people, documents, processes, and does the subcommittee appear to need to dig deeper into content or take a wider view of the challenges they're considering? So we'll make sure if you don't have that, that you get that so that we can begin to make this evaluation and help each subcommittee move forward and dig a little deeper and narrow and confine the beam and those kind of things. So we'll make sure that you'll be able to do that digitally. Feedback is requested on this information by August 19th. If the subcommittee members, if you have feedback, if not covered in the survey, you can email me. I'll be glad to take it. And we'll distribute executive committee feedback to the chairperson to whom it applied. Once we get that feedback, take a look at it, we'll give it back to the chairs, and the chairs will review that feedback, discuss it with some subcommittee members, and then take it into consideration as they continue their work. I'm excited. Can y'all tell? Because they say when I look excited, it don't even look like I'm excited. But I'm excited because I think that there's significant work being done and going forward. And I can't wait to see what we're going to finally end up with. But I think there's significant progress already being made. And the subcommittee, communication subcommittee, will be reporting out and trying to communicate this to the larger community in the near future. And we're talking about that. And so I'm excited. I want to thank each of you for your work already. We'll be getting back with you. Thank you for hanging in there tonight for the reports. I don't think they were that long, but it's just we had 6 of them. And so thank all of you for what you're doing. Let's see what's going to happen in the future. And I think we're making significant impact. Thank you tonight. We'll look forward to subcommittee chair meetings next Tuesday. God bless you. Have a great evening. Stay safe. Thank you for your reports.
Good night, everybody. Great job.
Night.
Pastor Warren, let's get together.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Hey, Bishop, I'm praying for you, sir.
Thank you. You know I need it. Thank you.
You know I got you.
Thank you so much, Bishop, for what you're doing.
Thank you. Y'all making me look good.
Hey, man, I'm glad I put the squeeze on you, but you did. All right, brother. Thank you.
Katie, you doing a fabulous job too.
It's my pleasure. And just so everyone knows, if you're still here, the survey is linked in the chat, but it's also in the report, which we sent out. So, and that'll all go to the committee meetings.
Okay, I need that. Well, God bless you all. Have a great evening.
Good night.